Tanks, A Century of Tank Warfare by Oscar E. Gilbert and Romain Cansiere is an utter failure. It's a catastrophe, it's a disaster. Welcome to a book review at the German Tank Museum. Today we're going to review this book, Tanks, A Century of Tank Warfare by Oscar E. Gilbert and Romain Cansiere. I hope I pronounced it right. I try to. And before I start reviewing, or better criticizing this book, I want to get something out of the way first. This is a very short book, but that's not the main problem I have with this book. Short books are very important. They're good, they're important. Easy, readable introductions to all topics are very much needed. This is true for every topic. Every time a beginner wants to start to learn something, he needs an entry point, some book he can read in 1 or 2 days and start from there his learning process, so to say. First orientation, a starting point, that's important. Yes, if you write a short book, you have to simplify, you have to reduce things, but that's totally okay. Shorter books are allowed to do this. That's again not my problem with shorter books. And to prove this, I brought 2 examples how this can work. One example I love to show is the series A Very Short Introduction by Oxford Press. In this case, the Soviet Union. That's one big topic, very well written on 150 pages. A German example, same format, you see, the CHBEC Wissen series. In this case, The Italian Fascism by Wolfgang Schieder on 115 pages, 115. Both very well written, both with very complex topics, both well done, and both of series that show that it's doable with nearly every topic. So short introductions are good. That's not my problem. This book, though, is not good. It's heavily flawed in a couple of ways, and it's full with errors, with omissions, with oversimplifications, with pub talk. Yeah, and that's what I'm going to criticize now, what I'm going to review for you. But I wanted to get out of the way that my criticism is that's short or simple. That can be good. They tried it here, the authors, and they failed. But it's not a problem in and itself. So, to be fair and to criticize the right stuff and correctly, I did something that I usually do not do. I made notes. So if I look down to quote stuff or to make sure that I don't forget something, please bear with me. I think if you are critical towards a product of authors, you have to be fair and do it right. So I want to make sure everything is correct. So let's begin. At first, when I saw this book, I really was delighted because we need a readable, easy introduction to the field of tanks. There are several books that are easy to read, but most of them are just technical lists with photographs and no context, no overarching history, no multitude of perspectives. There's no industrial, no political history, no economic history, no social history. The human experience is not there. Mostly, they are just catalogs of tanks. There are some exceptions of that. For example, this rather good book by Bruce Goodmanson on armor, which is very broad in its perspective on 200 sides, so a little bit bigger. But it has a shorter chronological scale. And Goodmanson, rightfully so, said he wants to write about aspects that are not written about everywhere else. So the typical stuff, the fundamental information about the tank as an historical phenomenon are not here. If you've read them, I heavily recommend this book. It's very good. But although it seems like an introduction, it is not. Another example people tend to buy at first is this book, Tanks by Richard Ogorkovich, which is a very good book, although we are not small anymore. We are now at 300 pages. But this is the classical technical book. There are not many photos and drawings. It's all text, but it's numbers its caliber, its weight, its everything you need. It's type after type after type. Sometimes there is something about the usage and the doctrine, but not so much. Excellent book, though, as a reference book, but not the overall introduction you want. An overall introduction should show you the multitude of aspects a topic has, give you a brief glance at what each topic includes, what's to be told there, and then send you off with a list of literature for you to read, to find more, to delve into the depth of the topics you like. So when I bought Tanks, it seemed to be just that, because it's relatively recent, 2017, and it's well produced. That's an important thing, often a sign for a good book, not in this case though. And when I opened it, there was a very intriguing first sentence or first paragraph. Quote, "This short history will explore the evolution and historical use of the tank, but not in the usual way. There will be little emphasis on the technical aspects, engine horsepower, armor thickness, weapons caliber and penetration, as those data are available from innumerable books and websites. Instead, we will delve into the history of how developmental decisions were made and the evolving doctrine for the use of the tank." Quote end. Great. That's great. They are absolutely right. You have the numbers everywhere. You don't need a book anymore to see how the front arm of a Panther was or how the side arm of a Sherman was. That's everywhere. What you need is a history that for the full 100 years shows you where the tanks came from, how they were designed for what, how they were used, and how the interdependence between those factors were. So this book promises it. And I was happy because that's exactly what we do here in the Tank Museum. But that concept, sadly, is not followed at all. Instead, we get a meandering account with widely changing perspectives, widely changing focuses from tiny tactical focus to grand scale world strategic focus, shifting all the time, full with errors, simplifications, omissions, pub talk, and quite frankly, a confusing national focus regarding which nation gets how many pages in this book, but we will come to that later. I tried to cluster the errors and the doubtful stuff to give this video a structure, but at one point I gave up. I just go through the book and just highlight errors and dubious stuff I found in there to show you why this book should not be worth your £8 or $13 or I think 12 euros in Germany. Okay, let's start. This book is structured chronologically, which is perfectly fine because you could cluster the topics, but this tends to confuse beginners and laymen more than it helps, so that's perfectly in order. The first point I stumbled upon was when I was thinking, what's going on here, was the idea that the first truly modern armored fighting vehicle was the Czech battle wagons. Okay, you can discuss this. I find it refreshing to get away from the idea that the tank is based on the chariot of the Egyptians or Assyrians or Sumerians or whatever you take. But to say that the Czech battle wagons were the first truly modern armored fighting vehicles is kind of daring, since the modern fighting vehicles need at least combustion engines. Even if you say you can have a wood armor instead of real modern armor. But never mind. That was a point where I was confused, but okay, each to their own. They are authors, they have their opinions, that's good. The next point was exactly the same. In the era before the Great War, there are many projects floating around in Europe. Ideas of how to combine armor plates, guns, combustion engines, and tracks or tires or small feet or whatever you have, or real big wheels, into one fighting vehicle. And normally, if you're short in space in these books, people tend to take Günther Bustin as the example for this, because this Austro-Hungarian officer designed on paper a vehicle that really resembles a modern tank, revolving turret, tracks, all you need. So it is refreshing that the authors took another example of the other projects people had in their minds, because all these projects, all in Europe, are mostly forgotten, which is really sad because they are very interesting, they're very creative sometimes, and they are a sign for how the idea of a tank or something tankish was in the air, how it was a sign of the times, and that's very important. So at first I was delighted that they took, and I have to read this, Léon Levavasseur's project as an example for the, as they call it, first true modern tracked and armored fighting vehicle. And it's true. In 1903 he designed something that closely resembles an assault gun, self-propelled gun, Sturmgeschütz, whatever you want to call it. And it's important that it's here because that's one of the truly modern concepts people tend to overlook if always Günter Bustin is just quoted, cited, and portrayed. Then again, they just left out Günter Bustin. So this important step of the first tank, at least on paper, is omitted to have Léon Levavasseur, which is, again, a daring decision, but can be made. What can't be made, though, is writing it wrong, naming it wrong. We are in an introduction book where, if you write a 600 pages book with a wide scope on something, it's okay to have small errors in it. That's perfectly normal. We're all just humans, so that's okay. But in these 150 pages, you should at least get the names of the tanks that you name right. So in this case, remember, written by Cansiere, who's named here as a native of southern France, why ever this is important. In this book, we have the Levavasseur project, and its original name, and I hope I pronounce it at least acceptable, is Projet de Canon Autopropulseur, the self-propelled gun, the project for a self-propelled gun. The book, though, calls it Canon Autopulsier. Maybe right too, I don't know, technically, but it's not the name of the project. The project was named in another way, so that's a real error. And there are several of these. For example, the book states that Germans in the First World War built 63 armored A7V, the A7V, the A7V was the German tank and could be built as a lorry or as a tank with a armor on it. And the book states 63 armored A7V were built, which is untrue. There were just 20 of these. I can't imagine where this error comes from because, as they rightly said in the introduction, the numbers are everywhere. So it's easy to find out that there were 20 of the armored A7V. Yet you have this wrong number. The next example for factual errors is that they describe how the light Renault tank of the First World War was, as a project, remodeled to fit in the American production. The Americans wanted to build the First World War Renault light tank in the end phase of the World War for their own use, and they called it the M1917. In the book, though, this remodeling was called M1918, which is a whole other tank. The M1918 was inspired by the FT17, the Renault tank. The M1918 used parts of it, but it was a complete other tank built by the Ford Corporation in the United States. It's the first American tank, so to say, although heavily rooted in the Renault tank, and it's a complete other tank. So the authors in this book just name it plain wrong, which in itself is disturbing, as I said, on 150 pages. But later on, they even draw false conclusions, because in the interwar period there comes, quote, large stocks of M1918 hindered development of new designs well into the 1930s, quote end. They mean in the United States. There were no large stocks of interwar tanks or Great War tanks in the US, especially not of the M1918, because it was never mass-produced. So it's doubly wrong, and it's for two eras that it's wrong, and it's just not understandable. This brings us to a structural problem. If you write an introduction to tanks, you need to write globally, internationally, because the tank is an international production. Everybody, all the designers, the technicians, the inventors, were inspired by each other, they stole ideas from each other, they reacted on the designs of the other sides. So a tank history has to be international. Another thing is if you write a book about the German Panzerwaffe or the French tanks or the British tank, that's another thing completely, but this has to be international. So the different nations have to have their room in this book regarding to how important they were at the point. The Americans, the United States, however important they were politically, strategically, war-wise in the 20th century, were never very important tank-wise. Yet the book makes the complete opposite approach. The Americans dominate the book by far. I have a small graphic prepared for this. What you see here is a diagram showing the relative quantities of how big the chapters about the different nations and the chapter operations are in relation to each other. And as you can see, we're talking about the First World War, in which the Americans, or the United States to be more precise, never built tanks in significant numbers, never used tanks in real significant numbers, and surely not invented any tanks or made any breakthroughs on the field. But if you look at this, and I have to look down on my print here, if you look at this, roughly a third of the whole chapter on the First World War is dedicated to the United States, in which nothing much happened. Great Britain, which actually invented the tank, brought it to the battlefield, got a small, tiny part of it. France, which is often not really good represented because they're very important, gets its fair share. That's okay. But it's hard to see the relation to Great Britain if France is so big, but never mind. Germany and Russia are practically omitted, which is perfectly fine because they didn't invent anything significant either. And the operations get a bigger part, that's okay too. But again, the American part is ridiculously big in this chapter. This now, and I have to change my prints here, this now is the distribution in the Second World War. And now it really gets ridiculous. The tank warfare in the Second World War is a very important topic. If you look at the distribution here, it's utterly unreasonably written from an American bias standpoint. You have nearly 40% of the pages dedicated to the Pacific War, in which the tanks were not especially important and for sure did not make any technological or doctrinal progress that was in any kind relevant for the following decades. I mean, look at this. You have the Pacific War with nearly 40% of the pages. You have the United States with nearly 10% of the pages. What for? I mean, the Sherman is a very important tank model for sure. The mass production is important, the usage is important, but that's it. If you want to place a focus on this, you have to pair the Sherman, let's say, with the T-34 and the Panzer III and talk about how medium tanks were more important than Tigers, for example, or whatever. But giving the United States nearly 10% of the pages, while France, the pinnacle of tank operations, the moment where modern combined arms warfare came into fruition, gets 3% of the pages. That's nothing. The whole Eastern Front, where thousands of tanks clashed in this storm of steel, Mary Habeck, great book, gets 8%. Yet the Western Front, Northern Africa, Italy, and the Pacific get a combined 80%. All of which are not really the point where the tank is really, really important. You have, for example, for France, you have one page in which is nothing explained. It's just a short page saying that the Germans conquered France. The only thing that's written there is how the French tanks were actually better. Then there's no explanation at all. Yet in the Pacific War, you get smaller battles with more pages. It's ridiculous. So this is one structural problem with the book, which makes it, in an overall view, nearly unusable. The next thing that astonished me was this. According to the book, the interwar was, quote, a period of general stagnation for military development, quote end. What, please? The interwar period was one of the most deciding periods of the tank history at all. More progress was made on the technical and tactical side in the interwar period than in the whole Great War, basically. Yet the reasons are there, obviously. Quote, the British and the French were happy with the doctrines that had won the Great War. Quote, and no, they were not. They were not. The British were particularly happy to discuss stuff. They were really arguing about how the next war would go and which role the armor would play. If there would be an all-armor force, if armor would be forgotten again because it was just the child of the trench war, if there would be some kind of combined arms warfare, whatever. The British actually created the nucleus of the later panzer divisions when they had their mechanized experimental force and tried really to mechanize their army, albeit just on a small experimental scale. But they tried, they discussed, they really argued, they had different thoughts of school. Same is true for France. There was a big discussion about how the next war would go, exactly along the same lines. They had the problem that there are thousands of Renault light tanks dictating that they should use them again because they cost a lot of money. And they had one, so they tended to take the easier solution for the problem, but they were not happy and therefore declined their military discussion. No. Interestingly enough, on the other side, quote, Germany was forbidden to own heavy weapons, quote end, yes. And because of that, they were more free in their thinking than the French, for example, because they were not tied down by old material. They were able to think freely. So they came up with pretty fresh new ideas about operational warfare, technology, radio, and stuff like that. So it was not the reason for general stagnation in Germany. The interwar period and the being forbidden for heavy weapons was the reason why they progressed. End quote. The Russians were involved in a savage civil war. Quote end. Yes, they were in the beginning. Later, they made fundamental breakthroughs in doctrinal thinking. Deep battle is another version of blitzkrieg, if you want to use this word. I don't. They made real progress in this time. This is so wrong. It really makes me slightly mad because this is not a false name of a tank or a false number. It really takes a crucial decade in the development of the tank and completely disregards it. And if you're a beginner and you read this, for a long time you could overlook one of the most important phases of the tank history. That's unforgivable. And now the quotes mount, so I have to look on my paper more often. For example, this is interesting about the German interwar period development. Quote, the French Maginot Line was much on the mind of the German planners. Yes. And the plan proposed a 100-ton tank with a 150mm gun. No, it didn't. It did not. How in the world would it make sense? Super heavy tanks are just debatable at best. I know that. But we are talking about a mountain fortress line of hundreds of kilometers. How does it theoretically make sense to have a super heavy tank with a 150mm gun? Should they shoot the mountains to pieces? No, the Maginot Line was on the mind of the military planners. Yes, of course. But in other ways, completely other ways, you have to think operational, even strategic here. Tactically too, but not with a super heavy tank. I can't even begin to think where this comes from. Some obscure paper tank, again on paper, played up as a reason for German military planning. That's absurd. That's really absurd. Quote, a new German tank doctrine was pioneered by General Oswald Lutz and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Guderian. No, but that's more complex. That's for nothing. That's something you could actually discuss, but in this form, it's oversimplified. As I said, for short books, you have to simplify. All good. This is oversimplified. It's repeating old myths. Well, at least Oswald Lutz is in here, but then again. The place where German doctrine parted ways from the other European doctrines wasn't the call for a super heavy tank. Again, there is no call for a super heavy tank in the German doctrine of the interwar period or even the war period. Thinking from the mouse or things like that is backwards thinking, is taking obscure, minuscule developments of a few involved people as a description of a big process including thousands and hundreds of thousands of people. The German minds were on Bewegungskrieg, operational warfare, maneuver warfare. And the place where German doctrine parted was actually that they found a way to actually do combined arms warfare with Panzerdivisionen, with self-sustainable divisions. That was the thing, not super heavy tanks. That's yeah. Same thing for France. The fall of France, the whole process of Fall Gelb and Fall Rot gets merely a page on which the quality of the French tanks is rightfully told, but there's no explanation why the Germans won then. It's just the Germans attacked, the French tanks were better, then the war was over, or the operation was over. That's actually it. It's just one page. It's let's see, I have so many prints here now. War in Europe. And the Battle of France, I hope you can see this. This is the Battle of France. And this is all, it's one page. Later in this book, the Battle of the Gilbert Islands, I don't know how significant this is. Pacific is not my strong suit, but it seems to be just one battle of many. The Battle of the Gilbert Islands in the Pacific gets 2.5 pages. Nearly 3 times the room the fall of France gets. One small fight in Vietnam, 1969, gets a whole page, like the whole France. That's a ridiculous misproportion. France, you have so many things to tell about France. France is the pinnacle, the central moment of operational tank warfare. And there are so many things you can tell about this, how the French and the British doctrines and technology is paired with the German doctrine and technology, how this was a stopgap or not, the famous attack. It's so much to tell. But there's nothing here. It's just one page, and completely obscure, unimportant stuff gets 2 pages, 3 pages or more, but the obscure stuff is US stuff, and this seems to be the only reason. On the other hand, when the authors go into strategic and operational doctrine, they seem to overstate the American influence by far. For example, they have this idea that I cannot even fathom to think what comes from, that the Americans actually were the pioneers of modern combined arms warfare in their heads and in the theory at the end of the Great War, where they actually just learned how to do this stuff. But according to the authors, they had a full-blown theory of combined arms warfare of the future. And the German victory in France is, regarding to the authors, the consummation of the unfulfilled American armored warfare plan from the last war. That's absolutely ridiculous. Nothing of the sort. The Europeans had, which this book completely omits, as I said, the Europeans had complex discussions. They evolved, they progressed the concept in little steps because it's really complicated. You can, having the idea of running with tanks and flying with planes and then winning, that's not a unfulfilled American armor warfare plan. That's just an idea. But making it into an actual doctrine is hard work on paper and training. And the Europeans did this, the Americans did not. And it's ridiculous how this book tries to establish this narrative. Then again, even regarding his own army, or the author's own army, as I said, Oscar E. Gilbert says here is previously a U.S. Marine Corps artilleryman. Even there are real errors. He still repeats the old idea that, quote, that according to American doctrine, quote, that tanks should not engage tanks, quote end. He actually says it twice, which is untrue. They were not the primary weapon against tanks. Tank destroyers were the primary weapon against other tanks. But there's no rule in the American doctrine that they should not or were forbidden to engage other tanks. Of course, tanks fought tanks. And of course, the American doctrine said, if need be, of course, go ahead. If you have the time and the room, the space, call the tank destroyers. They are specialized for this. But the idea that the doctrine said that tanks should not engage tanks is just completely wrong. Regarding the other armies, the authors naturally get everything wrong too. Quote, German overall doctrine was now, we are talking 1943, 44 now, was now the Vernichtungsschlacht, wrongly written, destruction or battle of annihilation, an outdated strategy of attrition. That is so wrong, you can't even overstate how wrong it is. The idea of a Vernichtungsschlacht, a battle of annihilation is the correct translation, is the opposite of a battle of attrition. It's an old yin-yang, it's an old bipolar discussion in the German army since the 1900. The opposition of battle of annihilation and battle of attrition is one of the foremost permanent arguments in the German army. It's complete opposites. Yet the authors just say it's this thing that somehow is the whole thing. By the way, saying that this was the new doctrine for 1944 is utter nonsense too. By the way, if you use foreign words, let somebody check that they're written right, because you have, for example, Sturmtaktiks. That's Unsinn to have your German word for that. That's nonsense. That's Sturmtaktiken, although this is problematic at best. Sturmgeschütz, it's called Sturmgeschütz. It's one of the most famous German military words. Vernichtungsschlacht, please. Vernichtungsschlacht is written as you said yourself in the introduction, it's out there. You just have to copy and paste it from Wikipedia. But then again, you even have authors wrong, like Steve Zaloga. Steven Zaloga is one of the foremost tank writers. But these authors even butcher his name. So that's for you. In the Cold War, the idea not to talk so much about horsepower or caliber or armor thickness goes out of the window completely. From now on, it's just numbers and types and technical data. Still, there are errors like wrong German naming still. And for example, you have the one of the central Western European main battle tank projects, the main battle tank 70, or as it's called in German, the Kampfpanzer 70. The authors, call it the Panzerkampfwagen 70. So Panzerkampfwagen is the old word for tanks in German. It's just Second World War, maybe the first years of the last years of the 50s, maybe. But in the 70s, Panzerkampfwagen 70, nobody would have said that. It's just completely wrong. They just made it up. Because in every book you can get, there's always in every good book, there's always the correct name, Kampfpanzer 70. So again, this book takes a central project of the tank history and names it wrongly. And it gets even better. They not only name it wrongly, the main battle tank 70 is presented as the forerunner of the Leopard, one of the most iconic tanks of the Cold War, which it wasn't. The Leopard was there before the main battle tank 70 project. The main battle tank 70 project then had some ideas, some technical solutions that went into the Leopard 2, but that's a whole other tank. It's not just a number, they are completely different tanks. And again, the timeline is completely wrong here. Then again, technical stuff is not the only problem. The book is very good on He-Man pub talk. I like this quote. The American forces had grown soft on occupation duty in Japan. There's no doubt that especially the tank doctrine of the US Army suffered between 1945 and the Korean War. They do say so themselves. There's a number of reasons for that. Growing soft on occupation duty is not the main point. There's tactical and operational insecurity at this point, how to use tanks correctly in the new time of the nuclear war and in other theaters. It's not just that the guys had gone soft. Then again, our authors do like this style, and I think now that we reached the Cold War, which I guess is the era of our authors here, the style gets more poetic. Let's say, for example, a single M26 spearheaded the epic attack that opened the crucial Tong Tong Pass to allow units to escape the chosen reservoir. It actually sounds better if you use this 1950s newsreel language or voice. This might or might not be true, but this is no style for a scientific book or for a objective book, neutral book. And sometimes they didn't even bother to research anything. As we've seen, there are wrong foreign words, there are complete wrong descriptions of what went on or what meant what. And sometimes they just gave up. For example, it is impossible to determine anything about Chinese Tang doctrine. For you it is, but there are researchers that do this. Next sentence the same. North Vietnamese armored doctrine is virtually impossible to discern. Again, to you it is, if you don't read the actual stuff. There are studies about how the Vietnamese and the Chinese used their tanks. Of course they are. They are harder to find, and they are not as easy to thumb through like you obviously did with the other books, but it's out there. So that's sad. That's really sad. Saying that Chinese and Vietnamese tank doctrine is not there, not researchable, that just speaks about you, not the topic. The nuclear aspects that shaped the use of the tanks, the technical design, remember the introduction, the development, how the decisions were made, should be important in this book. But the nuclear influence, the nuclear battlefield that really shaped tank and tank usage in the Cold War is not even mentioned. Not at all. It's just not important here. We are in the Cold War, and it's not important. Neither tactical nuclear battlefield weapons nor strategic nuclear weapons. It's not understandable. Even if they delve into something like the design of a tank, it's sometimes ridiculous. For example, there is a small chapter about the Merkava, the main Israel battle tank. And Israel Tal, the designer, made some design decisions which made a good tank. And since the logic is as follows, since the Israelis won wars with it but couldn't really sustain the one territory, it's actually Israel Tal's fault that there still is tension and conflict in the Middle East. That's what actually is written here. Apropos Merkava. Remember, quote, we will delve into the history of how developmental decisions were made. Yet the Merkava, as one of the best documented tanks, or one of the tanks with the best documented developmental history, is merely discussed at all, and when even wrong. There are books and books about how Israel Tal did what and why he did what. It's there in the details, and yet they get it wrong. For example, the iconic back door, the Merkava has a back door that opens up, is here still referred to as an escape door and a door for foot soldiers, which it wasn't. It was not. It acted as such, of course. It's an escape door, hence the soldiers get out quicker, and that's good. So it was an escape door de facto, but it was designed as a means to get ammunition quicker into the tank, because in many situations, Israeli tanks ran out of ammunition because they were firing from fortified positions, they were burning through the ammunition while firing, and they needed ammunition in the tanks quicker than before. The old system in all tanks is to load it through the hatches. They didn't want it, so Israel Tal designed the back door to get ammunition there. You can even bundle ammunition and shove it into the tank. That's great. That's the reason why it was made. So a book which wanted to delve into the history of how developmental decisions were made not only doesn't talk about this, it even draws the false conclusions. And in the end, if you have suffered through all this, if you read the book, there's no literature. There's nothing to go on. It's an introduction. If the introduction did its job right, you get at the end and you say, now I want to learn more, and there's nothing. Of course, no sources are mentioned because I don't know what the sources for this book were. but not even a list of literature to go on. So let's make a quick conclusion. Tanks, A Century of Tank Warfare by Oscar E. Gilbert and Romain Cansiere is an utter failure. It's a catastrophe, it's a disaster. It does not only not fulfill its own aspirations, it does not fill the gap on the book market by accident or sheer luck. But since it's full of errors, every beginner, every layman is better off with not reading it. Because in this case, they are not fed with myths, simplifications, oversimplifications, pub talk and errors. And, be honest, United States propaganda on an impressive scale. So, to the authors out there who are thinking about writing a tank introduction book, please do. We need one. If any of you knows such a book that I don't know, short introduction about the tank that's easily readable, please write it in the comments. The next book I will review here is an introduction to tank warfare, but it's a little step up. It's a very good book by Alaric Sale about armored warfare. But this one too is edging at the 300 pages and it's a little bit more scientific, a little bit drier, but it's at the moment the best introduction we have. So that's the next book. Until then, bye-bye.